3. We'll go ahead and get started. So I'm Linda Sechrist, the president of the Southwest Florida Reset Center. We've been together for 3 lovely years, and we're a nonprofit. And we were just consider ourselves a small group of caring and committed citizens who wanted to make a difference in the communities that we live in. And so we put our heads together and came up with the idea for the Reset Center. And it's an acronym. RESET is actually an acronym, which means restorative, ecological, social, economic transformation. We're looking for transformation within ourselves and our environment. So we have with us today, we're all really all excited about our guest. And we have some housekeeping things I just want to remind you of. Holly will keep you all on mute so we don't have any background noise while the being recorded. If you have questions for Eric, please put them in the chat, and Gary will be the one who will be fielding those questions. If you have a question that you want to ask yourself directly, let Gary know. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Holly.
Okay, it's such a pleasure to be here and to welcome Eric. I had written out sort of a composite of all these wonderful bios for him, but I think most of you know his bio, and he sent me a humble but very inclusive biography this morning. So I'm going to read that and then turn it over to our friend Erica Klopf just for a few minutes to let her give Eric a personal introduction. But Eric has studied and he practiced and promoted perennial agriculture for almost 3 decades, and he's a senior fellow with the Global Evergreening Alliance, correct? Evergreening Alliance, and he was a senior fellow with Project Drawdown, which those of you who know us here at the Reset Center, has been a core of our inspiration, is Project Drawdown. Eric is also the author of The Carbon Farming Solution and many other books. And so I'm going to let Erica talk a little bit about who he is to her in this community, and then we'll get started. Erica, can you unmute yourself?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Holly.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it is such an honor to introduce Eric to y'all from a personal level. In life, you know, you all remember when you were starting off your careers and figuring out what you were doing, you identified role models and mentors, you know, and you did that partially because of what they were working on and what their accomplishments were, but you also do that because of their character. And Eric has always been a person that I look up to so much, not only because of the immense amount of things he's accomplished, but also because of his huge capacity of kindness and care. And that's why he does this work, is because he cares so much about the subject matter. And that is what has been driving him all of these years. These are the textbooks that are going to help fix these problems that we're going to be talking about. And he's doing it because of his immense interest in the subject matter, like absolute fascination with plants. And then also just because he deeply believes in them as solutions. This is solutions-based work, which is what we should all be focusing on. So yeah, I'm just so grateful that he's here, and I would like to introduce him not only because of his accomplishments, because of his huge capacity. So Eric, take it away.
Oh, that's very kind. Erica didn't mention that she's helping me write a book right now, which is really, really, really fun. It is a great pleasure to work with someone who is so incredibly botanically, literate and everything, as Eric is. So we're working on a book about trees with edible leaves, and it's going to be awesome. It's going to be great. So, all right, well, let's see. I've been asked to do just kind of like a big, the big picture on agriculture and climate change mitigation. And then I think there are plenty of Southwest Florida kind of examples in there. It's interesting because you're a place where the kinds of practices that are causing climate change are very evident in agriculture, and you're a place where the impacts of climate change on agriculture is also very clearly seen. And Southwest Florida happens to be, where I would move if all things were right in the world. I love it there very much. So it's nice. It's really nice to be here. And let me, I'll share this screen and we'll walk through. So this is mostly from a publication that I did for Drawdown that came out last year. It's up on their website, called Farming Our Way Out of the Climate Crisis, but it has a few things that are a little bit more recent because I try and keep up with the science and stuff. So we'll just kind of go through in a breezy way. I know many of you are familiar with a lot of these things, and hopefully we'll get some time for questions and discussion and whatever at the end. First off, the new numbers, just brand new numbers is that the food system overall is about 1/3 of all of humanity's emissions of greenhouse gases. A bunch of that is from land use change. That's really like mostly deforestation for agriculture, but some other things. Then we have actual agricultural production emissions from growing stuff and raising livestock. We have a bunch. Oh, sorry, that's in gigatons. That doesn't actually say gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The supply chain itself, that's like transportation, refrigeration, all that stuff, is the big piece and growing rapidly. In fact, retail has gone up by 300%. Emissions from food retailing has gone up by 300% in the last 15 years or so. And then some waste related emissions too. So it's a big piece of the puzzle. A lot of the conversation has really been about electricity and transportation, which is great and super important, clearly a problem, but also this is a set of challenges here. And particularly when we look at some of the non-carbon dioxide gases, methane and nitrous oxide, we can see that agriculture is a really, really big part, especially nitrous oxide. 80% of humanity's nitrous oxide emissions come from agriculture. That is really, for something that's 298 times more powerful than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, that's a pretty big deal. So that's a big place for us to be looking. And the way that Drawdown talks about this these days, which I just love, is you can imagine that climate change, we have too much of these certain gases in our atmosphere, right? Imagine if that's like a sink that somebody left on. You left the bathroom sink on, so the water is pouring out of the faucet into the sink, and then it's pouring over the sink onto the floor. So the water coming out of the sink is the emissions. And the first thing you do in that situation is you turn off the faucet. Then the second thing you do is you mop up the water, and that's carbon sequestration. So you don't want to just start mopping and leave the faucet on. That doesn't make any sense at all. It's never going to work. But you have to do both of them for it to work. The two things have to go together, and that's what we'll be talking a little bit about, both turning off the faucet and mopping up the water today. Oops. Okay, so first we can try to reduce how much food we need, which can help keep us from cutting down more forests and mangroves and so on in order to make new agricultural land. So the easiest way to demand less food is just to waste less of it. We're still wasting 30 to 40% of all food in the world that's grown. So imagine we could cut emissions from food production by 30 or 40% if we would just use it all. I'm sure that's impossible to get 100% food waste reduction, but we could go much, much farther and much better in this regard. So that's number one. not wasted. Number two is looking different kinds of food take different amounts of land in order to produce them. And that's a really big piece in terms of reducing the pressure on forests, which that deforestation is a big cause of emissions. Mostly it's for soybeans for cows and for grass for cows. So it's mostly, some of it's for biofuel, but really it's very much mostly for cattle. So we can ask how much land is required to produce, in this case, what, 100 grams of protein. So grass-fed beef, which people talk a lot about being a great climate solution, and it is in many ways, certainly requires a lot more land than growing soybeans or, heaven forbid, leaf protein concentrate or something. So the first thing is we want to think about how much land it takes to grow the food that we eat, and foods that use less land are, generally speaking, more desirable in terms of climate change. More intensive production like that is more desirable. All right. And there's lots of ways to do that. We can grow more on the land we have through certain agroforestry techniques, through other kinds of efficiencies, but also we can grow food in places where there is no food now. So if we can grow food on a rooftop or in an urban lot or just in a regular lawn and turn it into a food production area, that in a certain way takes pressure off of forests and helps to reduce those emissions from deforestation. It's more complicated. We can get into that if you want, but it's a basic idea. And there's sort of this narrative that the only way to grow more food on the land we have is to use lots more feedlots and chemical fertilizer. And while that does grow more food on the piece of land, it has its problems that come with it. There are lots and lots of other ways to grow more food on the land we have without any of that. Sorry, I need to make my thing stop calling me here. Can we turn all that off? My apologies, everybody. Okay, back to business. Okay, so then there's changing diets. And again, we want to look at the foods that have the highest emissions and try and reduce those and try and eat more foods that have low emissions. The trick is that any of these things can be raised in better or worse ways. So it's hard to actually attach a figure to a specific thing because it can be, again, in so many ways. But generally speaking, anything from animals is going to be higher. Anything from animals raised on land is going to be higher. Generally speaking, plants are going to be better in terms of emissions, although some of them, like chocolate and coffee, are pretty bad, which is horrible news for everyone. I think palm oil, of course, is associated with a lot of deforestation on peatland, although there are good ways to raise oil palm as well. And it's tricky because it's very hard to get all that kind of information to the store when you're buying something and say, well, this is the good kind or the bad kind or whatever of all that. There's a lot of nuance in how things are raised and transported and what the land was being used for beforehand and so on that are tricky, but generally more plants is good. Because livestock are such a big part of the source of emissions. They're using most of the land, they're producing most of the emissions. A third of all the crops that we grow in the world are used to feed to livestock. And yet they produce a pretty small amount of the food overall. So they're disproportionately, livestock production is disproportionately responsible for the emissions from agriculture. And there are some people in the regenerative agriculture world who would like to say that's not happening, and I just must disagree. But we'll get to the good part of livestock too. One example is from all the feed that we give, let's say to chickens before we eat them. If we feed them, 100 kilos of for every 100 kilos of feed we give to chickens, we get 13 of meat, and the rest is feathers and bones and manure and respiration and stuff. So it's an inefficient use of food to feed things to livestock that humans can eat. And particularly looking at beef there, you can see it's grain-fed beef is a very, very inefficient use of food that humans could eat, but also they can eat things we can't. And that's really where we want to look here is, okay, well, a lot of the world's farmland is grassland, and you can't grow other things on it, or there are less other options for what to do on it. So that makes some sense. And we can raise them in places where in a number of different places where it's really hard to grow crops, dry and rocky places and remote places and so on, steep hills. Not that you all know, a hill is this thing that you all don't have down there, but they're sort of shaped like this, and you can, anyway, they're not good for plowing. An amazing thing about livestock is they can eat things that we cannot. They can turn grass into food. They can turn tree leaves into food. They can turn food waste and crop residues into food. And these are traditionally what livestock ate until, relatively recently in history. And they can play a role in improving fertility, and when integrated into a farm can do a lot of really neat, interesting things. So it's not so much that it's everyone should be vegan or everyone should eat 3 grass-fed steaks a day, which sometimes I feel like is what that conversation boils down to. It's really which livestock and where and how are they being raised, but overall less in the diet of your average American, much, much less. And there are ways to raise livestock that are very friendly in terms of climate. We'll talk about some examples of that. But if they did eat only things we don't eat, the estimate of how much we would have is much less than the average American eats today. We eat between 50 and 60 grams of animal protein per day. And the best studies I've seen give us more like 21 grams a day. So, between half and a third as much as we eat now of animal protein. And that's not just meat, but dairy, eggs, all of it. So there is a role for livestock in a climate-friendly agriculture. I think the evidence supports that, but it's a smaller role than they play now. And very much the trend is going in the other direction, that more and more meat is being consumed around the world. And there are places where people could use to eat some more animal protein. Even a little bit of animal protein in some people's diet can really assist them to get better access to the nutrition in the food that they have, in the plant-based foods that they have, but less, I think. And certainly there's no arguing with that. It would be great if lots more people were vegan, and if you are, thank you very much, because it uses so much less land. It's really wonderful. And there are ways to improve on a vegan diet as well, by leading into vegan perennial crops and so on. There's always ways, whatever any of us are doing, there's ways to do it better. So in the home, we want to be reducing our food waste, and what we can't reduce by eating it ourselves, we can compost it or feed it to chickens or a worm bin or some other thing, or and try and eat foods that have low emissions and don't use a whole lot of land in order to do that. Yeah, that's a little bit about what you can do in the home. So in the supply chain, there's lots of things we can do here. One of the big issues is refrigeration, which is very energy intensive, but also uses these refrigerants that Drawdown has written about that are very, very, very powerful greenhouse gases. If we can move the electricity that's used in the supply chain to cleaner energy, that's great. If we can optimize transportation in certain ways, that's great. We're just really starting to figure out, scientists are just really starting to figure out what mitigation looks like in the food supply chain, but it's a big deal anyway. Transportation, for example, we talk a lot about it being a really big deal, but like food miles and stuff, but it's not actually. I have newer numbers than this. It's about 5% of global emissions from the food system. So not a huge source of emissions in the food system. And sometimes it's actually worse to ship it halfway around the world than to grow it relatively locally. So it's not that local is always better, but it often is. And that's because not all, if everything else is equal, the same amount of miles, it would be better to have less miles than more miles. But different kinds of transport have really different efficiencies. So like a train is a million times better than a car, or ocean shipping is way better than airplanes in terms of emissions. And then they also, that's the mode. Then there's the load, which is how full they are. And if you can fill a vehicle like a truck or a train or a ship really completely full, then you have less emissions per ton, per kilometer, mile, or whatever. And then finally, there's the issue of the fuel, where some fuels are better than others in terms of emissions, and trains are really absolutely the best. They're an excellent mode. They can have a full load, and they can run completely on clean electricity, which to me makes them the transport system of the future. So, oh my gosh, how do you figure out what to eat at home? You know, you want to try and get things that are grown the best way you can. You can either buy very local, like less than 25 miles away, which is pretty much always better, or not do any extra driving, at least for it, and try and buy things that aren't processed so much. The processing of food is a really, really energy intensive undertaking. So the more processed something is, like to get a Pop-Tart is much more energy than to get a bowl of rice, let's say, for example. As I said, we're breezing through the entire planet's food system in a short time. So, okay, so emissions from actually growing food, what are they, and how do they stack up? The highest source is the digestion of ruminant livestock. The methane from cows and water buffalo and camels and goats and sheep and whatnot is definitely the biggest single source of emissions in agriculture, followed by manure, which also comes from livestock, but includes pigs and chickens and other, not ruminant livestock. Synthetic fertilizer comes after that, which I would say is a pretty big one in South Florida. Methane from rice comes after that, and then there's sort of a miscellaneous category. So these are the broad sources that we're looking to reduce. This is the faucet that we want to turn off, and there's lots of ways to reduce emissions from all of these categories, and I won't go into all of them. That's a whole 2-hour thing I would be happy to do for you all sometime, but there are feeds we can offer to ruminant livestock that reduce their emissions, like this asparagus seaweed that we have in the photo there, which has some studies have shown a really, really powerful ability to reduce up to 90% ability to reduce emissions from livestock. That's a pretty big deal. And it looks like you can stack multiple different kinds of methane reducers, and they will add up to increasing emissions reduction in ruminants. So I think that's going to be a big deal. In terms of nitrous oxide from manure on pastures, which is a big contributor, there's a kind of grass called brachiaria, which would grow extremely well in South Florida. That is an amazing nitrogen scavenger and really uses and captures that nitrogen so quickly that it's not able to escape as emissions. That's a fun one. For synthetic fertilizers, there's just not overusing it is sort of the first thing, and then there's a lot of other places to go from there. Rice production, I don't think that's really a big deal in South Florida, but there's sort of alternate wetting and drying and other kinds of approaches there, and we can go on, but there's lots and lots and lots and lots of these. They're really fun, and haven't, I think, been getting as much attention as the carbon sequestration. And I love carbon sequestration, but I think these are really neat too. Got to turn off the sink as well as mop up the water. So in the home, yes, that one is discussed, Brad. Thank you. In the home, if you are using synthetic fertilizers, it would be using the right amount would be the first spot, or to replace with better kinds of fertilizers, not only organic ones, but also they make like slow release synthetic fertilizers that are much, much better in terms of emissions, like Osmocote is one that I use in my nursery pots here and stuff. I'm all organic in the garden, but in the pots I use synthetic fertilizer because I haven't found anything organic that will keep going for a whole year. Then we move into carbon sequestration. This is where plants do this great thing. They take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which we have too much of, and they strip off the carbon from the oxygen. They give the oxygen back to the atmosphere, which we enjoy for breathing. And they make all kinds of cool stuff out of the carbon. They make sugars and lignins and cellulose and hydrocarbons and all kinds of fascinating things. They feed some to soil organisms. They keep some in their biomass. And in the case of a tree, that might be for centuries. Some of it ends up becoming organic matter in the soil. Organic matter is something like 57 or 58% carbon on a dry weight basis. And most plants are about 50%, an average of 50% on a dry weight basis. So that's carbon coming out of the atmosphere, coming into our gardens and farms, and we'd like to keep it there instead of having it go right back up into the atmosphere again quickly. We're trying to store it for as long as we can. And different practices have different impacts. Generally speaking, the more trees you have, the more carbon, broadly speaking. But it doesn't go on forever. Carbon sequestration continues a certain number of years, a certain number of decades, and then slows down in almost all cases, with the possible exception of certain tropical forests, which you all might be close enough to in order to be able to mimic that effect. But basically, it slows down. And also, it's very vulnerable. A fire, a return to less climate-friendly farming practices, an extended drought, a flood, any of those things can cause that carbon to be released back to the atmosphere again. So it's not as permanent as turning off the faucet, but we can't get there without it either. So, but it doesn't make sense to put all one's eggs in this basket either. It's part of a sort of a balanced breakfast of climate change mitigation, but it's not powerful enough to do it itself, even though some people have very much claimed that. I don't think the science bears them out on that. So there's better ways to grow the annual crops we know and love, better ways to grow rice and beans and potatoes and arugula and whatever it is that you like to eat, with things like cover cropping and mulching and compost application and reducing tillage and on and on and on down the list. There's lots of ways to do these better. And then there's this sort of model of trees around the edge of the farm or field, living fences and this kind of stuff, which increases carbon some. And is a great kind of next step for a farm to take if they first start with, let's say, nutrient management or cover cropping, and then they move into some trees around the edge. And then you can really begin to bring those trees into the middle of the field with various kinds of agroforestry practices, which is where the carbon really starts to go up dramatically, quite dramatically sometimes. Fully perennial crops are a great way to go, especially woody perennials like trees and bamboo and things like that can have outstanding carbon content. There are, as I was saying, better ways to do grazing, perhaps not quite as great as was being promoted, as has been promoted, but absolutely can sequester carbon and also can reduce the emissions of nitrous oxide and or methane from those ruminants as well, which can be really desirable. One of the things that's working really well in tests, in trials, is just applying like a half an inch of compost to a dry rangeland. They found very, very impressive gains in carbon sequestration over multiple years from having done this in California. So that's a really interesting model. And they just do it once, and that alone seems to do a lot. It's pretty neat. Well, again, I think this has been oversold by some people who maybe love the practice more than the science. I really do think it is a big piece of the puzzle. And at Drawdown, we found that this was a very promising approach. Somehow you can have better livestock and have people eat less livestock And that's actually the best way to go. Eat less and have it be better was sort of our conclusion. Silvopasture systems combine trees and pastures and livestock together. The trees might be just shading the livestock, or they might be feeding them in different ways. And intensive silvopasture, which is really exploding in Colombia and Central America right now, and in Mexico actually as well, is an extremely powerful practice with very, very high rates of carbon sequestration. The tannins in the leaves of the Lucina they're eating has a powerful impact for reducing nitrous oxide and methane. And they use brachiaria grasses often as well. So there's an additional nitrous oxide emission reduction there. The challenge is that in Florida is that I believe it's pretty well illegal to grow Lucina there. So it would be just a matter of testing out other things and seeing what would work in that kind of a system instead. There's no shortage of nitrogen fixing woody plants that grow in Florida that a cow will eat. So including lots of native ones that I think would be worth playing with. So at the home, this is our home garden here in Massachusetts. It's frozen wasteland right now. There's lots of things we can do to grow better food. We can turn our lawns into food gardens and plant lots more edible trees, including trees with edible leaves and fruits and nuts and what have you. So overall, the food system at Drawdown, we found that it was 42% of the mitigation potential that got us to 1.5 degrees was from land and food and agriculture. On the other hand, so we think its potential to mitigate climate change is disproportionate to the amount of emissions it produces. And that's partly because other sectors like buildings or transportation can't really sequester carbon. They can only reduce their emissions. This sector can reduce its emissions, and this is the only one that can mop up the water. The other ones can only turn off the faucet. This one can do both. So that's kind of fun. This one in the middle here is the new Drawdown publication. Well, it's new last year anyway. That kind of goes through a lot of what I covered today that I wrote for them last year and we put out last year. Table is a really interesting British effort looking at sort of the food system as a whole and looking at food waste and diet and all this kind of stuff. They're a little bit more conservative than I am, I would say, but I've gotten a lot out of reading, and they have a lot of really good like backgrounders on different kinds of topics. And then you might enjoy my own books and websites and stuff too. So that's our little walk through through the world of agriculture and mitigation. And we do still have, I think, some time for questions and comments.
Thank you, Eric. Before Gary fields the questions, I just wanted you to know that we've been live streaming on Facebook, but I'm going to stop doing that so that you don't all have to be on Facebook. But your talk went on and people listened, and that's the first time we've ever done that. So thank you, Eric, so much.
Sure. My pleasure. Let's see, a couple questions I see. I put the spelling of brachiaria up. Lucina, I think people, I think it's classed as invasive in a lot of Florida, but I have seen it grown at Echo, and I think there's good and bad ways to grow it. I think you could grow it safely. In that context, it's never even getting to flower, I think, the way, let alone set seed in those intensive silvopasture systems. Conserving water and still growing food forests and gardens. I might field that to some of the Florida gardeners who are on the call, who might know better than me, like Erica. And can we make chocolate without palm oil? Yeah, you can use just about any kind of oil, or you can use many kinds of oil. I would say coconut oil is probably, generally speaking, a much more climate friendly source of oil, but now we're beginning to see more and more deforestation for coconut. We're seeing more and more deforestation for avocado. So it's really, not the plant's fault. I think it's really, there's a system that needs to be changed. And certainly given that you can grow coconuts very nicely in Southwest Florida, that would probably be, if I was doing it locally, that might be what I would do.
I have a question for you, Eric, and that is, if you could speak to the reduction of emissions based on local organic farming, would it not increase the amount of labor, giving more work for people? Would it not also be good for soil health, healthier food, and better health for people?
I think it would provide all of those benefits. Yes, and the labor issue is the big challenge in a lot of cases when farm workers are paid as low as they are. In many places, nobody wants to do it, or there's certainly, as we've seen in parts of southern Florida, there can be some highly exploitative labor practices. Really, I mean, part of what would be nice in order to create an environment that this kind of agriculture would thrive in would be some policy changes and reprioritizing of how we run our economic system in order to make that kind of thing work better. And I think there's some degree to which these practices clearly can take off very well in the current, system that we have. Some of them have done extremely well. System of rice intensification. There's 10 million farmers in Asia practicing system of rice intensification. There are, millions of acres in organic around the world. There are hundreds of millions of acres in agroforestry around the world. But it's very hard it's so much harder to do that when it's so hard to be a farmer in general, or so hard to be a farm worker in general. So I think to see the kind of rapid transformation of the food system that's necessary, we need to see a real shifting of economic priorities as well. And I'm leaving that to you all. It sounds like that's in your mandate over here, right? It's in your acronym and stuff. So
in Drawdown, there was a farmer from North Dakota who was featured, whose first name I forget, but his last name was Brown.
Gabe Brown. Yeah.
What is it?
Gabe. Like Gabriel?
Gabe Brown, yeah. And I'm wondering, I've seen a number of his videos and see the benefit to what he has done. I mean, he raises 27% more corn on his land than other farmers in that area, and uses none of the chemicals that, even if he had runoff, it wouldn't be laden with all those chemicals. How much of that practice is transferable to South Florida?
Well, okay. He has really different soil. He has soil. That would be the first difference. Yeah. As you move closer to the tropics, more and more of the carbon is held in above ground biomass and like leaf litter, and less in soil. And that's particularly true in sandy soils. So I would say that I would probably look to practices in South Florida leaning harder into the tree component in order to maximize impact. And I love what he does. And I think he has gotten the publicity that he deserves. And there are also, millions of other people doing great stuff around the world, and doing what works in North Dakota isn't always right in Florida. And yet it really, very much of it can be in terms of livestock integration. I think that's a great fit. In South Florida, there's almost nowhere to go but up from how most farming is happening in South Florida today. I think there's so much room for improvement in every direction compared to, let's say, a lot of how some of the vegetables I've seen raised down there, or sugarcane or things like that. I think there's lots of ways to improve.
And if you could wave a magic wand and change the practices, the current practices, how would the farmers change their practices to improve them the way that you would love to see them?
That is a good question. Well, I feel like on the one hand, there are going to be some really innovative farmers who are pushing way out ahead, and there's lots of them in South Florida already. I think about Josh Jameson, for example, just to be one person, or I think about all the things you see at Echo, which are so world class, demonstration kind of things. To me, I think most farmers, though, we want to meet them where they are and bring them one step forward in the right direction. And for many people, that's starting with nutrient management, just starting with no longer over applying chemical fertilizer. Let's get that nitrous oxide out of the atmosphere. And then you may do some additional improvements to fertility. Meanwhile, you might be trying to reduce tillage and improve, get some cover cropping going in there, maybe some compost application, depending on what scale they're at. So there would be some kind of soil health, better annual cropping kinds of practices. Then you might start to bring some perennials around the edges of the farm or on contour. Contour is a thing they have on hills, which is this thing you all don't have. But, on the other hand, in Florida, some riparian buffers, some water quality buffers of vigorous perennial grasses or other things are very, very much called for. So that would be it might be, instead of erosion and contour, really water quality might be the issue to figure out how to get more perennials on those farms. And then eventually bringing as many, switching to a perennial crop where possible, or just bringing in some more perennials into the field, bringing those trees into the field wherever you can. There's sort of, I don't feel like there's any one pathway that all farmers must take, but there's a right next step for any given farm that works for the land and that farmer that they can figure out. And our job as a society is to help them have the resources in order to do that. Finance, land tenure, training, access to seeds and plants, all of those kinds of things together.
This is
Okay,
everything
thank
we
you.
want to be working on, Eric. And this community here, I just interrupted with a question. It just burst out of me. I'm so sorry, everybody. I know that Jimmo and a few other people have questions in the chat, but how would you recommend our little pockets, that us not be in silos practicing and come together as a community? How could we work together better as a community in our whole bioregion, and our other communities doing that in their bioregions around the country with community gardens, food sharing, food security, and drawdown, and really looking for the big climate change solutions that apply here? Do you have any advice for us on building community among us?
Well,
That's
that's
a
the
hard
part.
question, I know.
I think that's the hard part. Yeah, I mean, the on a technical basis, it's not too late to avert catastrophic climate change. The problem is people, and we're like worse than goats when it comes to getting us to do things. If you've ever raised goats or it's herding cats or
Yes.
something. So
Raise goats, yes.
I'm not part of efforts like that myself where I live. These days, I used to do a lot of that, for my day job and stuff. And I don't know, I know that there's folks doing all kinds of drawdown adjacent organizing efforts like that around the country and around the world. I can't particularly point you towards anybody, unfortunately. I do think that keeping the science as part of the platform is important.
Yes.
But also not being like puritanical about it. I think either, having some flexibility seems to be important. And it does seem to me like food is a really good thing to organize people around, because it's a fairly universal experience. And it sounds like you have a lot of the folks in your network already who are really producing at different scales, whether it's home or commercially. There's the sort of like food waste actually could be a great project to work around, because nobody thinks food waste is a good idea. Just nobody in the world thinks that's a good idea. So how do that can be a really great beginning place in some ways.
That was my next question, actually, Eric, was how important do you think reducing food waste as a climate change solution? How much could a community work on that? And could we really make a difference by really exploring that as a community. I know we try not ever to have leftovers here, and what we can, when we're cooking, we put the ends and everything and coffee grounds in our compost. But yeah.
I think it's big, and it captures the amount. No, like you wouldn't let your child do it. So why do we as a civilization do it? You know,
Throw away
I think,
food and let it give off
yeah,
gases the way we throw it away, right?
it's really everything about it is wrong. So like, can you work? There's this sort of pyramid of ideal food waste usage, where at the top is redistributing it to hungry people before it goes bad. And then there's a whole set of things with their like slightly less good impact, still useful, but less and less, you know, climate wise, less impactful impacts. You know, that could be a great place to get all kinds of people involved. Churches are often very excited about that kind of work. Community gardens, chefs, it's something you can really bring a lot of people together around. And even people who aren't terribly concerned about climate change or do not love or believe in climate change care about food waste. And that makes it a really great sort of a bridge. That's a thought. And then they're okay, what do you want to do with it once you get it? How many people can you feed with it? Or are you feeding it to animals, in which case those become climate friendly livestock? I mean, if it's going to, let's say, pigs or chickens or something, and there are disease issues you have to think about, and there's regulations, maybe not in Florida, about what you're allowed to feed those animals. So you don't want to spread trichinosis or something, right? There's ways to do it, but I think it's a lovely thing, to a great sort of building block. Personally, I like the fruit trees myself. I love them, but I really see this as a and because part of the across the board with climate change, reducing consumption in countries like the United States is such a critical issue. It's an interesting entering wedge on that to say, oh, also, did you know we could reduce our flying for a vacation and our electricity use and the square footage of our homes, and on and on and on and on. It can be a nice way to start to make all that happen. So
there's a question, Eric, about urban agriculture and the place that it might be in making a difference for the things that we're talking about. And it raises for me the city agriculture that I've seen, where they have rotating trays for food growing in factories, basically.
yeah.
I wonder if you can comment on those.
Sure. I mean, I've spent most of my life doing urban agriculture, and I love it. I think it's great. That the actual area it occupies is so small that its impact in terms of carbon sequestration or whatever is probably fairly minimal. But we do a lot less urban agriculture in this country than almost anywhere in Asia. But one of the real benefits to it is that it is taking pressure off of deforestation. So I think it's worthwhile in that regard as well, along with all the other good reasons to do it. And it also offers the opportunity to tap into the stream of waste that flows through cities, so the food waste and the biomass waste and water that would otherwise be runoff and cause flooding or something like that. So it provides a lot of opportunities to catch and use things which would otherwise be wasted. I think that's a really nice opportunity with urban ag as well. In terms of these like vertical farming and other sort of high-tech approaches, I do think there's a context in which they make sense. I don't think they're ever going to replace in any serious way growing food in the ground or in the water. It looks like mostly what people are doing with them right now is growing high value vegetables in the middle of cities, which I think is a cool and interesting thing to do. It depends a lot on where the electricity is coming from. You're sort of replacing land with electricity.
Mm-hmm.
So you're using much less land, and that's really great. So it sort of depends, is it somewhere where land is more at a premium, or where green electricity is cheap and overabundant? So it sort of depend on that a little bit. And then there's like lab grown meat and stuff, which is I'm open to as a possibility. So far, it looks like it's very energy intensive, and I think it's still at $5,000 a hamburger. So I don't know why people are going around saying that is the solution to climate change when it clearly doesn't actually exist yet. Let's start with what we actually have, and then get this R&D working on some of these other possibilities. Great. What might there be 10 or 15 years from now? I'm curious about that. I still tend to go more for the lower tech stuff, but I understand that there, can be some value in that stuff, and I'm open to trying to, see how some of that works too. It's like, what are they feeding it? What are they feeding that lab grown meat, and what went into producing that, and how much electricity does it take? And mostly what I've seen for the life cycle analysis is that it's not really that great so far, but it could be different. It could be better.
Okay, well, I hate to bring the questioning to an end, but we do have a couple of announcements that we want to make about upcoming reset conversations. Holly, you take the first one on February 5th.
Oh, okay. I was just about to put that link in the chat. And I might ask Jimmo to unmute and just say just a couple of words, because we haven't agreed to go over the time. I don't want to go too long. But on February 5th, the Reset Center is really proud and excited to be hosting and partnering with a group called Just Learn. And we're going to do a circular design learning system here in Lee County and hopefully in the bioregion, starting with how we plant trees and track them, and also how we compost and share that information with each other, including with kids in schools. So Jimmo, maybe you could, if you want to say just a couple of words about it, and then we have a few other announcements too. And thank you, Eric, so much. You're an inspiration. And it was like, I'd think about something that would be your next slide or the next thing you'd say. So I love it when that happens. And
thanks, Holly.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, and thanks so much, Eric. We really are big fans of you. I highly recommend the Carbon Farming Solution books to everybody here. Sort of as a segue from what Holly just announced for the Circular Design Challenge, actually this has materialized since the Buckminster Fuller Institute cohort that Susan, my colleague, she's in the call here, and she led that mission, and now this is being deployed in Southwest Florida with partnership with Reset. And as one of the central pieces here, I'm very excited to see Holly discussing and demoing composting, for example, which we discussed a little bit today. But one of the central things we're working on are with trees, and specifically, you mentioned today just keeping the science intact in this fight for reforestation. If I can just briefly ask you a question, since you're such an expert in the space, with participatory reforestation models, one of the things we're looking to apply is to include the school systems a lot more in the initial stages of the tree life cycle, particularly the germination and the nursery, and to some extent the maturing of the tree saplings as well. But I was wondering if you've come across any models out there that sort of distribute community engagement successfully, that we could perhaps learn from and apply in the Fort Myers region or really globally. Thank you. Thanks again for your time.
Sure. I'll just put my favorite resource on that right in the chat. How about that? It's wocat.net, and they have a global database of projects doing different kinds of land restoration, and for a number of them, they'll actually talk about what the organization of it looked like, how were people reached, and how was it organized, and what was the budget, and was it led by the community, was it led by someone from outside, all that. So they have some nice case studies on that.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.
And then I just want to announce for February 18th, Gary,
Yes.
we're having a reset conversation with Joanne Smallwood from Smallwood Design and Doug Dent, who's the Vice President of Eco Laboratories in Cape Coral. They're going to be talking to us about the organic fertilizer pilot project that's been launched in Naples, in Baker Park, and on Gulf Shore Boulevard North. And what we'd like to do as Reset, partnering and collaborating, is to encourage this use of organic fertilizer, which has no nitrates and no phosphates in it, further on into like Estero and Bonita Springs and Cape Coral and Fort Myers. So it really reduces the toxic runoff that we have that feeds the algae problem. Gary, you're next.
And
with
yes, and that's right. That company is right here in Cape Coral.
Yes.
And I would like to announce it on February 22nd at 7 p.m. Southwest Florida Reset Center will host JCJ Cosentino. And she's a financial advisor with the Radcliffe Schatzman Group at Morgan Stanley. And I've had an opportunity to talk to her about her practice, and her sole focus and passion is socially responsible investing. And she says, this is my whole purpose in life. This is my way to give back and be able to gather as many assets as possible to support the companies and industries that are bettering our planet and humanity. And she'll offer her professional insights about this very important type of investing. So invite you to join us on February 22nd, 7 p.m. Of course, you can see those announcements on our website. And so finally, thank you, Eric, so much. And thank you all for joining us today. We do appreciate your donations to help support this work, and we'd be very grateful if you can do that. Holly will put a link in the chat where you can donate money to the Southwest Florida Reset Center if you wish. Thank you ever so much, and stay tuned. We've got lots of other things coming up, and we've only shown you the more current ones that are in the works right now. Thank you ever so much. And this is recorded and will be available on our website. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric, so much for being our guest speaker today.
Many blessings. Thank you so much. And everyone, I look forward to working together with you over the next couple of years. Let's get a food forest revolution happening in Southwest Florida. I'm with you on planting trees, Eric, especially fruit trees and food trees. So what an inspiration. Thank you all. Okay, we're going to end now.
Thanks,
Stay
everybody.
warm.
Thank you,
All
everyone.
right.
Bye.
Great job.